What if I told you that the economic policies running your country right now were tested first on a population that had no choice but to obey? No elections, no debate, no exit, just a laboratory, and millions of human beings as the experiment. September 11th, 1973, Santiago, Chile. Fighter jets circle the presidential palace. Bombs fall. A democratically elected government is erased in a single morning. But here's the part they don't teach in economics class. The coup wasn't just about power. It was about policy. And the men waiting in the wings, briefcases in hand, theories sharpened like scalpels, they had been preparing for this moment for years. They called themselves economists. History would call them something else. This is the story of how a small group of American-trained technocrats turned a nation's suffering into a blueprint that would be copied by governments on every continent, a playbook that quietly rewired the global economy. And it started with a simple, ruthless idea. If you want to change everything, you need a crisis, or you need to create one. Chile didn't just experience economic shock therapy. Chile was the operating table, and the surgery was performed without anesthesia. Before we go further, understand this. The story you're about to hear isn't ancient history. The mechanisms, the logic, the exact same arguments used to justify what happened in Santiago in 1973, they were used in Greece in 2010, in Argentina in 2001, in the UK in 2010, in country after country after country. You've lived inside this story. You just didn't know where it began. Now, you will. To understand what happened in Chile, you have to go back even further, to a university, a handshake, and an idea so radical its own creators knew it could never survive a democracy. It's the early 1950s. The Cold War is heating up, and Washington is terrified, not just of Soviet missiles, of ideas. Specifically, the idea that Latin American countries might look at their own poverty, their own inequality, and decide that capitalism wasn't working for them. The solution? Export a better idea, fast. In 1956, the University of Chicago and the Catholic University of Chile signed an agreement, funded quietly by the U.S. government. The deal was simple: send Chile's brightest young economists to Chicago, train them under Milton Friedman, under Arnold Harberger, immerse them in free market fundamentalism so deep, so total, that it becomes not just economics, but faith. These students would become known as the Chicago Boys, and they were brilliant, disciplined, absolutely convinced they had found the mathematical truth of how economies should work. Free markets, deregulation, privatization, slash government spending, remove price controls, let the market decide everything. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it had never actually been tried. Not fully, not purely. Because every time a democratic government flirted with these ideas, voters pushed back. People protested. Politicians compromised. The Chicago Boys watched this happen over and over again, and some of them began to quietly wonder, what if democracy itself was the problem? What if the only way to prove their theory was to remove the interference of public opinion entirely? Then came Salvador Allende. In 1970, Chile elected a socialist president, democratically, freely, legitimately. Allende began nationalizing industries, redistributing land, raising wages, expanding healthcare. And in Washington, and in certain offices at the University of Chicago, alarm bells started ringing. Because if Allende succeeded, if socialism worked in Chile, the idea would spread. Something had to be done, and the Chicago Boys already had a plan sitting in a drawer. They called it El Ladrillo, the brick. A 500-page economic manifesto, a complete redesign of Chilean society, written in secret, ready to be implemented the moment the right opportunity arrived. They just needed one thing: a general willing to open that drawer. A 500-page plan, a restless military, and a CIA that had already decided the outcome. The only question left wasn't if Chile would fall, it was how fast the experiment could begin. Chile is fracturing. The Nixon administration, working through the CIA, is pumping money into opposition groups, funding strikes, destabilizing supply chains, making sure store shelves go empty. Henry Kissinger, asked about the situation, says something that becomes infamous. He sees no reason why a country should be allowed to go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. Read that again. The irresponsibility of its own people. This is what democracy looks like to the men pulling the strings, an inconvenience, a variable to be controlled. By September 1973, the economic chaos is unbearable. Inflation is spiraling, truckers are on strike, the middle class is furious, and General Augusto Pinochet makes his move. September 11th, the bombs fall on La Moneda Palace. Salvador Allende dies inside, whether by his own hand or someone else's remains disputed to this day. By nightfall, the coup is complete. And within days, the Chicago boys are inside the government. Their 500-page brick, suddenly it's government policy. What happens next is where the story becomes something darker than most history books are willing to describe. Because Pinochet doesn't just adopt the Chicago boys' economics, he gives them something they never could have had under democracy. Total, unquestioned power. Price controls? Gone overnight. State subsidies eliminated. Public spending slashed by 27% in a single year. Wages frozen while prices explode. The Chicago boys called it shock therapy. The idea was brutal by design, moves so fast, so radically, so completely that the old system has no time to fight back, no time to organize, no time to breathe. And the results? Immediate devastation. Unemployment explodes from 3% to nearly 20%. Poverty rates surge. Hunger returns to neighborhoods that hadn't seen it in a generation. But the Chicago boys aren't concerned. This is expected. This is the necessary pain. The economy is purging itself, like a fever burning out infection. Milton Friedman himself visits Santiago in 1975. He meets with Pinochet. He praises the reforms. He calls it, and this phrase will echo through history, a miracle. A miracle. While political prisoners fill the stadiums, while economists who disagree are fired, exiled, or worse. Here is the detail that changes everything. The shock therapy wasn't just economic. It ran parallel to another kind of shock entirely. Because at the same moment the Chicago boys were dismantling the economy, Pinochet's secret police were running electricity through the bodies of anyone who resisted. Naomi Klein, decades later, would make this connection explicit and unforgettable. The same theory, the same logic, the same word, shock. Break a person down completely, and you can rebuild them however you want. Break an economy down completely, and you can rebuild it however you want. Chile was both experiments simultaneously, and the world was watching, some of it in horror, some of it taking notes.
The experiment was brutal. The suffering was real. But somewhere between the chaos and the crackdown, the numbers started to change. And that's when the playbook became dangerous in an entirely different way. By the late 1970s, something unexpected happens. The Chilean economy begins to stabilize. Inflation, which had been catastrophic under Allende and the early shock period, starts to fall. Foreign investment trickles in. GDP begins to climb. And the Chicago boys exhale. See, they say, the pain was worth it. International financial institutions take notice. The IMF, the World Bank, Western governments looking for a model, any model, to justify the economic restructuring they want to impose on their own populations. Chile becomes the case study, the proof of concept. But here is what the glossy reports leave out. The recovery is built on a foundation that would crack catastrophically within years. Because while the macro numbers look better, underneath, the structure is rotten. Deregulated banks are lending recklessly. Financial institutions, freed from oversight, are gambling with borrowed money. A small elite is accumulating enormous wealth, while the middle class remains hollowed out. Sound familiar? In 1982, the entire system collapses. Chile's financial sector implodes. Banks fail. The peso crashes. Unemployment hits 30%. 30%. In desperation, Pinochet does something extraordinary, something the Chicago boys never anticipated. He nationalizes the banks. He brings back regulations. He does, in a crisis, exactly what his economists had spent a decade telling him was economic heresy. The Chicago boys are quietly sidelined. But here is the twisted genius of what happens next. The narrative doesn't update. The story of Chile as an economic miracle, it continues, it spreads, it calcifies into received wisdom. Because the people telling the story have too much invested in it being true. The IMF needs a success story to justify structural adjustment programs it's about to impose on Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe. Western governments need intellectual cover for cutting public services, privatizing utilities, breaking unions. And so Chile 1973 becomes a myth more powerful than its reality. The failures get buried. The 1982 collapse gets footnoted. The torture gets separated, cordoned off, treated as unfortunate but unrelated. Just politics, not economics. But Naomi Klein's argument, and it's an argument that has never been fully refuted, is that they were never separate. The economic shock required the political shock to function. You cannot impose that level of radical overnight transformation on a free population. Free people push back. Free people vote differently. Free people go on strike, organize, resist. The laboratory only works when the subjects cannot leave. And this is exactly why the playbook travels so well. Because the next time it appears, in Bolivia, in Poland, in Russia after the Soviet collapse, it doesn't always need tanks and secret police. Sometimes it just needs a financial crisis severe enough to make a population desperate enough to accept anything. Create the crisis or wait for one. Then open the drawer. The brick is always ready.
Chile was the beginning, but the ending, the part that should keep you up at night, is that the experiment never actually stopped. It just got better at hiding itself. Look at the timeline. 1976, Argentina, military coup. Chicago-trained economists installed. Shock therapy applied. Thousands disappeared. 1985, Bolivia. No coup needed this time, just a debt crisis severe enough. Jeffrey Sachs arrives. Overnight price liberalization. Devastating austerity. The population too exhausted to resist. 1990s, post-Soviet Russia. The Soviet Union collapses, and Western advisors flood in with the same briefcase, the same brick. Privatization at hyperspeed. State assets sold for pennies to well-connected oligarchs. Life expectancy in Russia drops by 5 years in a single decade. 5 years. Economists call it transition costs. The people living through it call it something else entirely. 2001, Argentina again. The IMF's model student follows every rule, cuts spending, privatizes everything, pegs its currency, then watches its economy detonate. Unemployment hits 25%. The middle class, the people who followed the rules, trusted the institutions, did everything right, line up at ATMs that have nothing left to give. 2010, Greece. No military required, just the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the German Finance Ministry with a list of conditions. Cut pensions, fire public workers, sell the ports, sell the airports, sell the islands if you have to. The debt must be honored. The market must be satisfied. A democratically elected Greek government calls a referendum. The people vote no to austerity. The result is ignored.
The conditions are imposed anyway. Do you see the through line now? The specific mechanism changes, the uniforms disappear, the language becomes softer, more technical, more bureaucratic. But the core logic, the logic born in Chicago, tested in Santiago, refined through 40 years of application, remains identical. Move fast, create irreversible facts on the ground, frame radical transformation as having no alternative. There is no alternative. Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase, her personal motto, borrowed, whether she knew it consciously or not, directly from the intellectual framework that justified what happened in Chile. Tina, there is no alternative. It is the most powerful political phrase of the last 50 years. And it is a lie. There are always alternatives. There were always alternatives. What there wasn't, what the playbook was specifically designed to eliminate, was time. Time to think, time to organize, time to imagine something different. Shock works because it steals time. So here's the question you need to sit with. The next time you hear that a government must cut spending during a crisis, that pensions must be reduced, that public assets must be sold, that there is simply no other option, ask yourself who wrote that script. Ask yourself whose drawer it came from. Ask yourself what or who had to be silenced to make that argument sound like common sense. Because the most enduring legacy of Chile in 1973 isn't the coup, it isn't Pinochet, it isn't even Milton Friedman. It's the normalization of the idea that economic transformation requires human suffering as an acceptable price, that the pain is always temporary, that the market always knows best, that the people who resist simply don't understand. Chile's real lesson isn't about economics at all. It's about power. Who has it? Who designs the systems that distribute it? And who pays the price when those systems are tested on human beings who never agreed to be part of the experiment? The Chicago boys are gone now. Pinochet died under house arrest in 2006, never convicted of the crimes committed under his regime. But the brick never went out of print. It just changed its cover. If this story made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The most powerful thing you can do against a playbook built on silence is talk.